So, like you've probably guessed, today we're going to be learning how to preserve. We're not going to be canning, but I will talk you through what exactly canning is and how it works. But we're basically going to be doing the steps that lead up to canning. And we're going to be making refrigerator pickles and a fruit compote. So before we get started, I'll just go over knife safety a little bit. When you're not using your knife, make sure it's at the top of your cutting board. We don't want it on the edge where it can fall off. And when you are using your knife, if you need help, then you can get help. But otherwise, keep your fingers out of the way. So making sure not to be cutting too closely to our hands. And when you're done with the knife, stick it on the side of the sink rather than inside the sink. And that way you don't have to worry about when you reach in the sink to wash the dishes, you don't worry about grabbing the knife. So keep it on the side until you wash it. And then a few safety reminders for everybody. Wash your hands, so we'll take a second to do that shortly. Tie back your hair, put any loose clothing away, and we will be cooking with a few hot surfaces, so make sure to be careful near the hot surfaces. And before we get started, I'm just going to wash my hands quickly if you want to do the same. Okay, so like I said, today we're going to be preserving, we're going to do refrigerator pickles and an apple compote. So the reason we preserve is because fresh fruits and vegetables, they lose their quality really quickly. So we preserve in order to reduce food waste and to make the food last longer. There are quite a few different methods you can use to preserve. So typically people can, but you can also dry foods to preserve them. That will keep them for longer. You can ferment jams and jellies. That also uses the process of canning. And cucumbers can be turned into pickles. So canning is a process of you heat food, you put it in a jar, and then you process the whole jar. And so processing the jar is what keeps the bacteria away, and that's what keeps food from going bad. We're making refrigerator pickles, so we're not going to be doing the processing, but we will be heating the food, and then it can keep in the fridge for a little bit, but instead of a few years, it will probably keep for a few weeks. And the other thing we're making is a compote, which is similar to a jam, but again, we're going to be heating the food. We're not processing, but it can be kept in the fridge for a few weeks. And with that, let's get started on the recipes. So if you have the two recipes in front of you, there's the apple compote and the refrigerator pickles. We're going to start with the apple compote. So you can get that one out in front of you. And we're going to start not by heating the butter on the pan, which is the first step on the recipe, but we're actually going to start by chopping the apples because it's going to take quite a bit of time just because there are a lot of apples. So one of the first things you'll need to do is wash all your apples. If you haven't yet washed your apples, I would do so right now. And once you've washed your apples, you can put them onto a cutting board. We're going to be chopping them into bite-sized pieces. And you might need a bit of space, so mine are just in front of my cutting board right now. All right, and if you need a tip for how to chop your apple, what I'm going to do is I'm going to slice down one side, and then I'm going to place the flat side down and then just keep slicing along. So there's always a flat side on so it's not rolling around too much. So remember to keep your fingers out of the way, and I chopped one side off like that, and I'm going to place that down and chop the rest off. And then I'll dice it into little pieces. So my chunks are about this big right now, and now I'm going to basically, like you just said, cut it right into cubes. So I'm going to go lengthwise, and then I'm going to go horizontal. So just into cubes, not too small, and try to keep them all about the same size. But yeah, that's a great question, and that's what I'm doing right now. And I can show you the size of the cubes. Mine are about that big. It might be a little bit hard to see on your computers. If you already have your apples chopped up, if you want to do the first step there and then place the butter on the pan, and start heating it. And we'll just wait for everyone else to catch up, and I will continue chopping up my apples. And a fruit compote like this is kind of similar to something that you might have in an apple pie or an apple crumble. So with recipes like this, you could put an apple compote because it's going to be nice and sweet. You can put it on ice cream, or you could even put it on yogurt and have it for breakfast. You could also turn it into a crumble and add oats and sugar and stuff like that. But there's a lot of different things you can do with a recipe like this. So 6 large apples, that's what we're doing right now. 1 tablespoon of butter heating on the pan. 2 tablespoons brown sugar, 1/4 teaspoon cinnamon, and 1 tablespoon of lemon juice. So you can change the ingredients around a little bit if you want. If you wanted to add less brown sugar, you could even add no brown sugar if you chose. Or you could add more too if you want it to be sweeter. I'm gonna just finish chopping and I'm gonna turn my pan on. And when you keep your burner on, you can just keep it on low. It doesn't need to be very high. When I make this recipe, I like to let it sit for a while. And I just find that kind of lets the apples warm up nicely and it gives them a nice taste. Okay, I'm gonna put my butter on my pan if you haven't yet. And once your butter's melted, if it's already melted, go ahead and place the apples in. Awesome, I'm gonna go ahead and add my apples then. And then, I'm gonna measure 1 tablespoon of brown sugar and add that. So I'm just gonna put a lid on mine to capture the heat in a little bit. You don't have to do that though. You can feel free to leave yours open. And if you haven't yet added the cinnamon and lemon and your apples have been cooking for a few minutes, add the cinnamon and lemon juice now. I'm just gonna wait a few minutes, but I actually have a full lemon that I have to squeeze, so I'm gonna chop that in half. And I'm gonna use, if you are using a lemon, I'm gonna use about 1/4 of a lemon. And make sure also to stir it frequently so nothing's sticking to the bottom of the pan. Now we need 1 tablespoon lemon juice and 1/4 tablespoon of cinnamon. And if you really like the taste of cinnamon, and if your apples were maybe really big, you can also add more, but I'm just gonna stick with 1/4. And I'm gonna add my lemon juice. And make sure to mix it all together so that the apples are all evenly coated in the butter and brown sugar and cinnamon and the lemon juice, because we're gonna wanna get all those flavors in there. If your apples are already turning pretty soft, you'll start to see the color get a little bit translucent. You can probably take them off the heat. Like I said, I like to keep my burner on a low heat and keep it there for a while. So I'll stir this around a bit, then I'm probably gonna put it off to the side and we can start making the pickles. Mine are on very low heat and the apples are still really crunchy. So I'm just gonna move it off to the side. And while that's off to the side, I'm gonna get a new cutting board to start preparing for the pickles. We're gonna look at the second step for the refrigerator pickle recipe. And the second step is to combine the vinegar, sugar, and salt in a saucepan over medium heat. So I'm gonna go grab my saucepan and vinegar. I found for this recipe, instead of using 2 cups of vinegar, I like to use 1 cup of vinegar and 1 cup of water. It just makes it a little bit less acidic. But I'm gonna grab my pan, vinegar, sugar, and salt, and then I'm gonna combine them all right in front of me. Okay, for the pickle recipe, I have my pot right here, and I'm gonna pour in 1 cup of vinegar. And then I'm making a slight modification to the recipe. And I'm gonna do 1 cup of vinegar and 1 cup of water. And that's another nice thing about this recipe is you can kind of change it to be whatever flavors you want. So I'm gonna use a bit of water and then all the ingredients that I normally like to use, but if you wanna switch it up or not use an ingredient, that's totally fine too. It'll just change the taste a little bit. I'm adding 1 cup of water. And then to this, I'm also gonna add 1 tablespoon of sugar and 1 tablespoon of salt. So I'm adding 1 tablespoon of sugar. And the way you can tell it's a tablespoon is because there's little writing on it that says TBS, and it's a lot bigger, whereas a teaspoon says TSP, and it's a lot smaller. I added 1 tablespoon of sugar, and now I'm adding 1 tablespoon of salt. And I'm just gonna give them a quick stir together, but they're really not gonna mix until it's heated up. And I'm gonna take this mixture and I'm gonna put it on the stove and let it heat up for a while. We do want it to come to a boil. And while that's heating up, I'm gonna start cutting the cucumbers. So let's look at step number 1 on the pickle recipe. And step number 1 is slice the cucumbers in half or quarters and place into clean mason jars. So we're going to start with that. But before we do that, make sure you wash your cucumbers. So I'm going to give mine a quick rinse. I have jars about this big. You can use any jar or container. It doesn't really matter what you use. But since my jars are a little bit smaller and my pickles are a little bit too big to fit, there are a few different ways you can slice your cucumbers. So you can slice them the long way, and you'll have like little pickle sticks. I have just sliced them lengthwise before, and I don't know if you can see this, but this is what they turned out like. So just different ways of cutting them, but it all turns out the same way. And I'm just going to give my vinegar a stir right now because it's starting to heat up. And we want that mixture cooking on the stove until the salt and sugar have dissolved. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and take my cucumber and just slice it into coins. And for those of you following along with me, when I say coins, it's about that size. So it's like the size of a loonie, if that's the step you're on. And while I'm doing that, I'm just going to place them right into my jar, pretty much till the jar is full to the top. So with this recipe, you can make as many jars or as little jars as you want. Really just depends on how many cucumbers you have and how much solution you have, or how much vinegar you have to put into it. So remember when cutting to keep your fingers out of the way, cutting into little coins or vertically into strips, however you want to cut your cucumbers. Okay, and this jar, you can fill it almost right to the top if you have enough. If you don't, that's totally fine too. But if you can take a look at your computer screens, it might be kind of hard to see, but mine's almost full to the top. And you just, the most important part is when you're putting liquid in, you want the liquid to completely cover it, and that's about all. So the next step, and this is the second half of part 1, is to add the garlic, peppercorn, mustard seeds, and red pepper flakes. So since I have a little jar, I'm not going to add 4 cloves of garlic into the one jar. I might add just 1 clove of garlic. But you can change that depending on how much garlic you want in your jar. It's totally up to you. It'll just change the taste a lot, or a little bit. So if you really like the taste of garlic, add more garlic. If you don't like the taste of garlic, then you can add less. And I'll give you a tip if you're on this part of how to cut your garlic. So I'm going to take mine, place it on my cutting board flat, and then take my knife, the flat side of my knife, and press it down. So I place mine flat on the cutting board, my garlic's on the cutting board, and I put the knife on, and I just push down, and you'll hear a crunch. And then you might need to just chop the very ends, but that makes it a little bit easier to just peel the outside off. And then I'm just going to place my garlic right into the jar with the pickles. Or not yet pickles, but they're still cucumbers. And then we need 1 teaspoon of peppercorns and 1 teaspoon of mustard seed. So I'm going to grab all those ingredients. And your mixture with vinegar is probably starting to heat up, so you might need to give it a stir. If you do find that it's boiling, I would just shut it right off. As long as it's warm, it'll be good to pour over this. And this is another part of the recipe that you can really modify however you want. So the recipe calls for a teaspoon of each of these. You could add less, you could add more. I think I'm actually just going to do a pinch since my jar is so small. So I'm going to do a pinch of the peppercorns. And then I'm just going to do a sprinkle of mustard seed. And then the last ingredient that we're putting into these, or the second last ingredient, is the red pepper flakes. And if anyone's had red pepper flakes before, they're very spicy. So if you want really spicy pickles, then go ahead and add as much as you want. If you don't like spice, you don't have to add them at all. The recipe calls for 1/4 teaspoon, so that's a really small amount. I'm just going to add a really little pinch, because I don't think mine need to be too spicy. So that's my jar, and I have everything in there right now. My vinegar solution is starting to bubble a little bit, so I'm going to shut that off, and it's almost ready to be poured into this. And I'm removing it from the heat. Okay, and let's see what else we have left in this. Fresh dill weed. So this recipe says 8 to 10 fresh dill weed sprigs. And again, this is just going to change the flavor of your pickles. So if you really like the taste of dill, and I really like dill, I like when my pickles have a strong dill flavor, you can add more. If you don't want very much dill flavor, then add less. And with these, I'm just gonna pinch off the bottom of the stems. You can even just chop off the bottom. My vinegar solution's done. I'm gonna bring it over, and very careful because it's gonna be really hot, but pour it into the jar. If you have multiple jars, pour it into multiple jars, and you just wanna make sure that everything is covered. And that's basically all. So I'm gonna grab my vinegar solution, and I'm gonna do this over the sink just to be careful so I don't spill. But if you think you have a steady enough hand, I'm sure you can do it in your workspace. And mine looks like that. It's covered just to the top. And you will definitely smell all of the smells coming from it now. So you should be able to smell the vinegar, the dill is really strong, and the garlic. And that's basically your refrigerator pickles. It's that easy. And you can just put a lid on this. It doesn't have to be a mason jar like this. It could be anything. And that will stay in your fridge for a few weeks. It won't stay for months or years just because this is not heat processed like it is in canning. So it's not heat sealed. It doesn't create an airtight seal. So bacteria can still grow after a while. And that's the refrigerator pickles. And then I'm just going to check on my apple compote again. And all my apples are completely cooked too. And you can tell because they're softer. You can make as many jars of this or as little as you want. That's the nice thing about them. And they'll stay good in the fridge, but honestly, they probably won't stick around long enough because you'll probably want to eat them all. They're so good. And even with the apple compote, what I like to do too is stick it in a jar like this too. Because again, it's not quite like a jam or like pickles, but it's pretty similar. So I'd just fill up a jar like that and keep my apple compote that way. But you can put it in any sort of container and just eat it however you want. Okay, well, that's all I have for today, and I hope to see you all again then.